Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about one of the most important factors in the development of politics and the economy of South Africa in the late 19th century. And this is the discovery first of diamonds um, and then of gold in South Africa. This, as I said in the last lecture, put South Africa on the world economic map. It made South Africa a net contributor in a tremendous way to the world economy. And the conflict over the diamond claims and who would benefit from these served as one of the most animating features of late 19th century politics, and to the escalation of tensions between various groups, between the British and the Afrikaners, and the Bantu peoples and the Griqua. All of them were involved in some way. It also led to the development of society, especially to the furthering of racial segregation, as we'll talk about. In 1867, diamonds were discovered in the region just west of Bloemfontein, which had emerged as the capital of the Orange Free State. And there was a flurry of activity in the area, but for a few years it didn't yield a tremendous number of diamonds. These were all on the surface. But then they discovered much richer deposits further to the west, in an area about 550 miles northeast of Cape Town. That's not a terribly good reference point, I suppose. So this is all to say, pretty far from the coast. It's pretty far inland in a rather dry area. And almost overnight, a town sprung up in that area that was called Kimberley. And the thing about diamonds in Kimberley, and I don't pretend to be a geologist here necessarily, but there are these what are called pipes that are full of diamonds. These have emerged from much deeper in the earth through processes that have occurred over millions of years. And these pipes were very rich in diamonds, and especially in gem quality diamonds. Not all of them, of course, are gem quality. Many of them are used for industrial purposes, but lots of gem quality diamonds. And this is the area that saw the biggest rush. Okay, so Kimberley was a boom town. I just realized that on the slide here I've spelled Kimberley incorrectly. That should be Kimberley. That's a bit embarrassing. Sorry about that. But this rush led to a lot of individual claims, adventurers from all over South Africa, from other parts of the world. There were a lot of young British men who went to South Africa to to try to make their fortune in diamonds. Some of these individual claims were purchased by Africans or by Griqua. And so this is kind of a free-for-all. There were no rules or laws in place as to who could hold a claim at this point, right? Some of these claims were really quite small. It's interesting to look at pictures from the 1870s in Kimberley. And in fact, I found a website, if we can just take a look at this really quickly, a website where someone has put together a kind of slideshow of what Kimberley looked like in this period. And one of the things that you can see here, well, actually there are better slides than this, okay, is that, there are squared off what look like almost terraces here to the diggings. That's because these are individual claims, and some of the individual claimants had dug down further than others. Some of them were still in the process. This is a better view of it. You can see the squared off parts here. These would be little individual claims. Some of these were only, a couple hundred square feet or something like that, right? But they owned, I guess, theoretically, everything from the surface all the way to the center of the earth. And so, this whole area of rich diamond deposits around Kimberley was covered with these individual claims. You can see some more of it here. Here's a good view of it. I actually had this picture on a slide in the previous lecture. But, each of these are individual claims. Let's see. You can see how fast the kind of industrial equipment was put into place, right? This became the dominant kind of landscape of Kimberley. I guess these are ropes and pulleys to haul away the dirt and the debris. And anyway, so that, and then here's, the town. You can see the diamond merchant here, but this being a boom town, a mining town, you also have all other manner of businesses. Here's an auction hall. I assume there were lots of bars and hotels, and probably houses of ill repute and things like that as well, right? So anyway, this is a telling slide, I think. You can see, the whites dressed in very European style, and the African laborers dressed in almost nothing here. That's going to become a key feature of mining in South Africa for the next few decades. Anyway, that's I thought that was a really compelling set of shots of what Kimberley looked like in this period. Within a few years, though, companies had emerged, and there were individual claimants who had bought up a lot of land. The textbook mentions 3 of these. All 3 are quite important. The most important for our purposes was Cecil Rhodes, who went to Kimberley as a 16-year-old in 1869, began buying up these diamond claims, and by the early 1870s, by the time he turned 20 or so, he had amassed a large number of these and was emerging as a major player in Kimberley, in the diamond mining industry. And he entered into partnerships with other successful industrialists or miners. A couple of others that the textbook mentions: Barney Barnato, who was a London merchant, went to South Africa. He was actually I believe, the grandson of a rabbi. He was Jewish. But he ended up in partnership with Rhodes, and then there was a German guy named Alfred Beit, B-E-I-T, who was also Rhodes's partner. And these individuals, more than any others, were the ones who ended up being the kind of brains behind these large companies. And the reason for the companies is that, once all the diamonds on the surface had been extracted, they realized that this was only kind of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, or the tip of the pipes. That there needed to be a lot of capital put into extracting the diamonds that were much deeper in the earth, and so eventually 4 large mines appeared. The largest of these was simply called the Kimberley mine, and the remnants of the Kimberley mine are pictured here on the slide. This is known in Afrikaans as the Groot Gat, translated in English as the Big Hole. Okay. It is, I've been to Kimberley. I would say this is a good half a mile across, with this large pit in the bottom, which is now filled with water. This was the Kimberley mine, and the largest of these that was bought up by these companies, the De Beers company specifically, out of all of these individual claims, because these companies could invest in the capital, in the industrial processes, the industrial equipment that would enable them to reach deeper and deeper into the earth to extract the diamonds. And by the mid to late 1870s, there was one company who came to control a larger share than any others, and that was Cecil Rhodes' company called De Beers. Now, if you know anything about diamonds, you'll know that De Beers is still around. I see, especially around holiday times, De Beers commercials. De Beers has been responsible for slogans like "A diamond is a girl's best friend," "Diamonds are forever," and other sort of interesting slogans. So, pay attention to that. De Beers is still around. It's still extremely powerful. In fact, the dominant corporation in the diamond mining industry, and one of the most powerful corporations, I would say, in the world. But in any case, Rhodes was one of the founding partners of this, one of the controlling interests in it. He and Alfred Beit, and they went into business with Barney Barnato. They got funding from Lord Rothschild in London, And by 1880 or so, De Beers came to have a virtual monopoly over the major diamond mines in Kimberley, and that would have political consequences after this. The Kimberley sits in a territory that was contested space. There were 4 entities who all had a claim to this. The Cape Colony, controlled by the British, the Orange Free State. Some of the land around Kimberley had been claimed as farms by Afrikaners, and the British had even acknowledged this, so they had a legitimate claim to that. The southernmost of the Tswana chiefdoms also had some claims to the territory, and then the Griqua. And the British had allowed for the creation of this thing called Griqualand West, which was under the rule of a Griqua family named Waterboer. And the British ended up acknowledging the Waterboers as the legitimate rulers over the territory, but then they effectively incorporated Griqualand West into the Cape Colony. They convinced Waterboer to seek the protection of the British. It was then effectively taken control of by Cape Colony, and Kimberley became part of the Cape, right? So, and then through an arrangement with the De Beers Company, where a conglomerate of diamond merchants in London agreed to pay De Beers in sort of speculative fashion. The initial contract was for I think it was like £5.5 million or something like that, for all of the I don't remember exactly how long it was, the next couple of years of diamond diggings, whatever those would be, and this became a rolling contract that De Beers had with the British government, or rather with the diamond industry, which was closely connected with the British government. And so London became the gem diamond center of the world, and I believe it remains so all the way to the present. Anyway, that's how Britain came to have a monopoly on diamond, on the world market of diamonds, right? Is through this collusion with the De Beers Company. And I will say De Beers has continued to partner with governments. One of the most stable countries in Africa is Botswana, because and it's largely because of the diamond wealth that Botswana has. It's also very mono-ethnic. The Tswana people are the vast majority of all those who live in Botswana, so there's not a lot of ethnic conflict. But back in the 1960s, the government of Botswana entered into a contract with the De Beers Company, where they agreed to split the profits of all of the diamonds, and this way the Botswana government was able to bring in a tremendous amount of revenue. And that has contributed to the stability. I will say that Botswana gets roughly half, and De Beers gets the other half, right? So De Beers controls effectively half of not the entire GDP, but a good portion of the GDP of Botswana. So it's still a very powerful company. Now, in the diamond mines in Kimberley, there was strict racial segregation. Some of the early claims, as I said, were individual. Some of them were even controlled by Africans, but as these companies took over, they forbade, and they got the colonial government, the Cape government, to back this. They forbade blacks from owning any diamond claims. They created a hierarchy of workers, and you can see that in the images that we looked at. You can see it even in the one down here. All of the black laborers are shirtless. They are the ones who look like they're actually doing the work, and then these white miners are standing around supervising, right? All of the skilled labor positions were given to whites. Blacks were reduced entirely to menial labor for a fraction of the pay that the white miners got. And this would follow in the gold mining industry, and really continued all the way to fairly recent times. And probably still is a reality in many of the mines in South Africa. The wage differences were really stark. But beyond that, the colonial government and the companies created a situation where black laborers would enter into contracts with the companies, And they were forced through these contracts to be housed in all male hostels. They could not bring their families with them from, wherever they came from their chiefdom. They had to remain in these all male hostels. They could not go out of the hostels or out of the mine for the entire period of their work contract, which was usually 6 months or a year. Right, so they couldn't go out, get any kind of rest and relaxation, enjoy female company of any kind, even receive visits from their family. None of this was allowed. They were periodically subjected to strip searches and even body cavity searches, and they were punished severely, beaten nigh unto death, if they were found in possession of diamonds that they could not account for. Okay, and so these are humiliating circumstances for these black laborers. And they were reduced to a condition that amounted to slavery, right? Apart from the fact that, at least for the period of their time, they would be paid at the end of their contract, they could leave, but many of them, either went home for a brief period of time before returning to the mine because, or they simply stayed on for another term of contract because the amount they could earn there was a great deal more than, any other employment prospect that they had. Now, that set a precedent for what became a much larger industry in South Africa, which was the gold mining industry. In the late 1880s, gold was discovered in the Witwatersrand region, south of Pretoria, which was the capital of the Transvaal. And this led to the rise of what is now the largest city in South Africa, Johannesburg. This became, in effect, the gold mining capital not only of South Africa, but of the world. Right, by the end of the 19th century, South Africa, and specifically the Johannesburg area, was producing more than a fourth of all of the gold that was mined in the world. Much as had happened in Kimberley, initially in Johannesburg, there were small claims. And these were then bought up by large corporations, and that pattern followed. And in fact, the same people, the same companies were involved in this. Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Beit and Barney Bernardo moved their operations, or rather they extended their operations up into the Witwatersrand, and many of the industrial processes and the conditions that were in effect in Kimberley were put into place in Johannesburg. I shouldn't say industrial processes. Gold mining, requires a very different chemical process to extract the gold from the surrounding material. But the kind of mining technology, the tools of extraction, the railway systems, for the gold carts, and all of that, right? Required a great deal of capital. Okay, and so these fellows who were involved in the diamond mining industry were equipped to do this, and they quickly bought up large amounts of land and moved, or rather extended their corporation's holds into the Witwatersrand. Johannesburg, by the end of the 19th century, had a population of a couple 100,000 people, less than half of whom were whites. And it had a tense relationship with the Transvaal government. For one, the British, were very interested, and they had already attempted to annex the Transvaal. That's something we'll talk more about in a later lecture. But Johannesburg was firmly within the Transvaal. But it was seen by the Afrikaners who controlled the Transvaal as a kind of aberration, even as a den of satanic iniquity, because of the sort of atmosphere that prevailed in a mining town like that. Most of the inhabitants of Johannesburg, there were a lot of Afrikaners who went to work in the mines, but much of the white population was made up of British men who went there to try to make their fortune in gold mining. And the white population was dwarfed by that of the African population, given again the high demands for a large number of laborers. And so the Transvaal government worried about Johannesburg. They represented, they were equipped to represent really what Afrikaners had always been, and that is farmers who lived in rural settings, for whom cities were an anomaly. Many of them probably never visited a city, not even Pretoria, and they were devout Calvinist Christians, who shied away from the kinds of things that probably was happening in this boom town. And so there was an uneasy relationship there. One of the ways that these corporations assuaged the concerns of the Transvaal government was to set up, again, a strict racial segregation. Not that they, would have done otherwise, given the desire to maximize their profits and to pay the laborers as little as possible. The conditions were similar to Kimberley. They required the laborers to live in all-male hostels, though they did not, as in Kimberley, limit them strictly to being enclosed in these hostels. The African laborers were able to go out into the city. There were, businesses. One of the most common institutions you find in South Africa is a thing called the shebeen, which is really just a kind of bar. Small scale bar, right? So businesses like that erupted in the area of Johannesburg, frequented by miners there. Socially, there was a dramatic division between genders. The vast majority of inhabitants of Johannesburg in this period were men, both among the Africans and among the whites, right? And so women were few and far between, and this, led to, a number of social consequences of a high rate of crime, a lot of violence, things like that, right? In Johannesburg, and this is partly to appease the Transvaal government, and in fact, this was in part due to legislation passed by the Transvaal government. They instituted pass requirements. So Africans who went to work in the mines had to obtain a labor pass, and they had to go everywhere with their labor pass. If they were stopped by a policeman, they had to show their labor pass. If they didn't do that, they could be subjected to severe penalties, to incarceration, to sort of deportation out of the area, to fines. But the employers would often take the passes and hold them, and so these laborers, were subject to the capricious whims of their employers on a frequent basis. The boomtown of Johannesburg did see the emergence of a number of small businesses. Many of them started and run by either Africans or by Afrikaners to supply food and entertainment and other things to the mining population. In fact, the colony of Basotho land, the kingdom begun by Moshoeshoe there, ended up being a major supplier of food to the Witwatersrand region. They would send carry grain up to Johannesburg and trade it there, grind it into flour and trade it to the miners. These companies didn't particularly like the small businesses because they could maximize their profits if they required their laborers to shop at company stores, to live in company housing, to effectively do everything in their lives through the company. And so the small businesses were a threat, and they were eventually crushed by these conglomerates through their collusion with, in Kimberley with the Cape government, in the Witwatersrand with the Transvaal government. These conglomerates, these mining corporations wielded a tremendous amount of power, right? So as South Africa reached the end of the 19th century, the mining industry really set a pattern for the organization of society, with the strict racial segregation, with blacks being treated as second-class citizens, really exploited in numerous ways for their labor, and otherwise subjected to inhumane treatment and conditions. Okay, so we will move on next time and talk about the relationship between the white European-dominated governments and the remaining chiefdoms of Africans, and continue from there with our discussion of the relationship between the British and the Afrikaners. Okay, but under all of that lay this boom in mining, and the consequences for the economy. So we need to be aware of this first.